Hey everyone, welcome back to another dive into history's most shocking secrets. Before we begin tonight's journey into the bizarre world of medieval marriages, hit that like button if you're ready to have your mind blown, and let me know in the comments what time it is where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see our global community gathering for these wild historical tales. Now, get comfortable, maybe grab a snack, because tonight we're exploring something that will make you incredibly grateful for modern privacy laws. If you think your wedding was stressful, wait until you hear what medieval couples had to endure on their wedding night. We're talking about traditions so strange, so invasive, and so downright shocking that they make reality TV look tame. For centuries, historians treated many of these customs as folklore, surely too bizarre to be real. But recent archaeological discoveries, church records, and surviving manuscripts have confirmed what seemed impossible. Medieval wedding nights were public spectacles, complete with witnesses, tests, and rituals that would make a modern couple file for divorce before sunrise. So dim the lights, because we're about to uncover 10 medieval wedding traditions that prove privacy is a very modern invention. Trust me, by the end of this, you'll never complain about your mother-in-law again. Number 1. The bedding ceremony, when privacy didn't exist. Picture this. It's your wedding night in medieval Europe. You've just finished the ceremony, shared the feast, and now you're thinking it's time for some alone time with your new spouse. Think again. Because in medieval times, your wedding night was about to become the most public event of your entire life. Welcome to the bedding ceremony, a tradition that turned the most intimate moment of marriage into a community spectacle. And no, this wasn't some rare custom practiced by a few weird villages. This was standard procedure across medieval Europe, from peasant cottages to royal palaces. Here's how it worked, and trust me, it gets weird fast. After the wedding feast, the entire wedding party would form two groups. All the male guests would surround the bride, while all the female guests would surround the groom. But this wasn't a gentle escort to separate bedrooms. Oh no, it was a raucous, drunken parade through the house, complete with singing, dancing, and jokes so crude they'd make a sailor blush. The men would literally carry the bride to the bedchamber, often lifting her above their heads like she was crowd surfing at a medieval concert. Meanwhile, the women would drag the groom in the opposite direction, sometimes stripping off pieces of his clothing along the way as good luck charms. The noise was intentional and deafening. Guests would bang pots, blow horns, and sing songs that were basically medieval versions of adult comedy shows. But here's where it gets really invasive. Once both groups reached the bedchamber, they didn't just drop off the couple and leave. They would literally undress the bride and groom in front of everyone. The bride's female relatives would remove her dress, her shoes, her jewelry, everything, while making jokes about what was about to happen. The men would do the same to the groom, often making crude comments about his readiness for marriage duties. Think this sounds humiliating? It gets worse. In many regions, the guests wouldn't leave until the couple was actually in bed together. They would throw the newly naked couple onto the bed, sometimes literally tossing them like sacks of grain, while everyone cheered and made jokes. Only then would they finally exit the room. But even that came with conditions. The door would be left slightly open, and the wedding party would often linger just outside, listening for sounds that proved the marriage was being consummated. In some areas, guests would even peek through keyholes or cracks in the door to make sure the couple was following through on their marital duties. Why did they do this? It wasn't just medieval people being weird for the sake of it. The bedding ceremony served several important social functions. First, it was legal proof that the marriage had actually taken place. In a world without official marriage certificates, the community needed witnesses to verify that the union was real and binding. Second, it was about ensuring the couple couldn't back out. Once you'd been publicly bedded in front of half the village, there was no pretending the marriage didn't happen. The shame of trying to annul would be enormous, so couples were essentially peer-pressured into staying married. Third, it was supposed to bring good luck and fertility. Medieval people believed that the more people who witnessed and celebrated the union, the more blessed it would be. The loud music and crude songs were thought to scare away evil spirits who might curse the marriage or make the wife barren. But perhaps most importantly, it was about power and control. The bedding ceremony made it clear that marriage wasn't just between two individuals. It was a community event, and the community had a stake in making sure it succeeded. Your sex life, your fertility, your marital happiness. All of it belonged not just to you and your spouse, but to everyone in your social circle. For noble families, the bedding ceremony was even more elaborate and invasive. Royal weddings might have hundreds of witnesses, all eager to confirm that the marriage alliance was sealed properly. The French royal family was particularly notorious for this. When future kings got married, practically the entire court would cram into the bedchamber to watch the couple get into bed together. Some regions had variations that were somehow even more embarrassing. In parts of Germany, the wedding guests would throw grain, nuts, and coins onto the marriage bed while the couple was in it, believing this would ensure prosperity and many children. In Scotland, the couple would be given a drink called the bride's pie, a mixture of wine and herbs that was supposed to increase passion, and they had to drink it while still naked in front of everyone. The really crazy part? This wasn't just for first marriages. If a widow or widower remarried, they might still have to endure a bedding ceremony, regardless of age. There are records of couples in their 50s and 60s being subjected to this public humiliation because the community needed to know that even older marriages were legitimate. The practice was so ingrained in medieval culture that trying to avoid it was seen as suspicious. Couples who wanted privacy on their wedding night were viewed with suspicion. What were they trying to hide? Were they not really consummating the marriage? Was there some deception involved? Over time, some families did try to make the bedding ceremony less invasive. Wealthy families might limit it to just close relatives rather than the entire wedding party. Some couples negotiated to be undressed separately and then placed in bed together while wearing nightgowns rather than being completely naked. But even these toned-down versions were incredibly public by modern standards. The idea that a couple's wedding night should be private and romantic was completely foreign to medieval thinking. Marriage was a social institution, and every aspect of it, including the most intimate parts, belonged to the community. The bedding ceremony finally started to disappear in the late medieval period, partly due to changing religious attitudes, and partly because people gradually began to value personal privacy more highly. But it took centuries to die out completely, and in some rural areas, modified versions persisted well into the Renaissance. So the next time someone complains about wedding photographers being too intrusive, remember the medieval bedding ceremony. At least modern wedding photographers wait until after you've left the reception to stop taking pictures. Number 2. The witness requirement, proving consummation. If you thought the bedding ceremony was invasive, wait until you hear about what happened after all those wedding guests finally left the room. Because in medieval Europe, your wedding night wasn't really over until you could prove to everyone that you'd actually completed it successfully. Welcome to the witness requirement, a legal and social tradition that turned medieval newlyweds into performers who had to provide evidence of their most intimate moments. And we're not talking about subtle hints or private conversations. We're talking about physical proof, public declarations, and sometimes even sworn testimony about what happened behind closed doors. Here's the thing about medieval marriage law that most people don't understand. A wedding ceremony, no matter how elaborate, didn't actually make you married in the eyes of the law and the church. What made you married was consummation. If you didn't consummate the marriage, it could be annulled as if it never happened. This meant that proving consummation wasn't just about satisfying nosy neighbors. It was about making your marriage legally valid. So how exactly did medieval couples prove they'd consummated their marriage? The methods were numerous, creative, and absolutely mortifying by modern standards. The most common form of proof was the morning after announcement. The morning after the wedding night, the couple was expected to appear before their families and wedding guests to formally declare that the marriage had been consummated. This wasn't a subtle nod or a knowing wink. The husband would have to make a public statement, often in front of the entire wedding party, confirming that he had fulfilled his marital duties and that his wife was now truly his wife in every sense. But a simple declaration wasn't always enough. Witnesses who had been stationed outside the bedchamber during the night would often be called upon to testify about what they had heard. These witnesses, usually trusted family members or community elders, would describe in embarrassing detail the sounds that came from the wedding chamber. Moaning, bed creaking, passionate exclamations. All of this would be recounted in public as evidence that the marriage had been properly consummated. In some regions, the tradition was even more invasive. The couple would have to provide physical evidence of the consummation. For the bride, this meant displaying blood-stained sheets as proof of lost virginity. The sheets would be examined by older women in the community, often the bride's female relatives, who would verify that the stains were genuine and in the right place. This practice was based on the medieval belief that all women bled during their first sexual experience, which we now know isn't always true. But in medieval times, the absence of blood could be grounds for accusing the bride of not being a virgin or for claiming that the marriage hadn't been consummated. The social consequences could be devastating. For noble families, the stakes were even higher. Royal and aristocratic marriages were often political alliances, and proving consummation was crucial for securing inheritance rights and preventing rival claimants from challenging the legitimacy of the union. In these cases, the witness requirement could involve dozens of people, including ambassadors from foreign courts who needed to report back to their own kingdoms that the alliance had been sealed properly. Some royal families took the witness requirement to ridiculous extremes. In France, there are records of royal bedchambers being fitted with special listening posts where witnesses could monitor the proceedings more effectively. Some courts even employed professional witnesses whose job was to listen for specific sounds and report them accurately to court officials. But what happened if a couple couldn't provide adequate proof of consummation? The consequences ranged from social embarrassment to complete social ruin. For peasant families, failure to prove consummation might mean the marriage wasn't recognized by the community, leaving both parties in legal limbo. The wife might be sent back to her family in shame, and the husband might be mocked as inadequate or impotent. For noble families, the stakes were much higher. A marriage that couldn't be proven consummated could be annulled, potentially destroying political alliances and inheritance plans. In extreme cases, the husband might be examined by physicians to determine if he was physically capable of consummation, while the wife might be examined to verify her virginity status. This led to some truly bizarre medieval practices. Some couples would hire professional consultants, usually older married women, who would advise them on how to provide convincing proof of consummation. These consultants might recommend specific positions, suggest ways to make more noise during the act, or even provide fake blood to stain the sheets if necessary. The church had a complicated relationship with the witness requirement. On one hand, they recognized that consummation was necessary to make a marriage valid according to both civil and canon law. On the other hand, many church leaders found the public examination of intimate details to be unseemly and potentially sinful. This tension led to some interesting compromises. Some priests would allow couples to swear a private oath before God that they had consummated their marriage, without requiring public proof. But this was often seen as insufficient by the broader community, who wanted more concrete evidence. The witness requirement also created opportunities for fraud and manipulation. Couples who hadn't actually consummated their marriage might fake the evidence, using animal blood to stain sheets or paying witnesses to lie about what they had heard. Some families would even hire actors to make appropriate sounds from a nearby room while the actual couple remained chaste. Conversely, families opposed to a marriage might challenge legitimate proof, claiming that the evidence was faked or that the witnesses were lying. This could lead to complex legal battles involving multiple witnesses, physical examinations, and even sworn testimony from servants who had prepared the bedchamber. The most extreme cases of witness requirements occurred during times of political tension, when marriages were arranged between enemy families or rival kingdoms. Each side might insist on having their own witnesses present to ensure that the other side couldn't later claim the marriage was invalid. This could result in bedchambers filled with representatives from multiple factions, all listening intently and taking notes for their respective leaders. Over time, the witness requirement began to evolve and become somewhat less invasive. By the later medieval period, some communities accepted simpler forms of proof, such as the couple's joint testimony or the verification of a trusted priest. But the basic principle remained the same. Your marriage wasn't real until you could prove you'd consummated it. The witness requirement finally began to disappear as legal systems became more sophisticated and marriage law became more standardized. The development of official marriage registries and certificates reduced the need for proof of consummation, and changing religious attitudes emphasized the spiritual rather than physical aspects of marriage. But the legacy of the witness requirement lasted for centuries, influencing everything from wedding traditions to marriage law. Even today, Some legal systems technically recognize the concept of consummation as necessary for a valid marriage, though the requirement for public proof has thankfully disappeared. So the next time you think modern weddings are stressful, remember medieval couples who had to perform for an audience and then prove their performance the next morning. Privacy, it turns out, is a relatively recent invention. Number 3. The blessed bed ritual, holy water and herbs. After learning about bedding ceremonies and witness requirements, you might think medieval wedding nights couldn't get any stranger. But we haven't even talked about what happened before the couple ever set foot in their bedchamber. Because in medieval Europe, preparing the marriage bed wasn't just about fresh sheets and flower petals. It was about spiritual warfare, fertility magic, and enough religious ritual to make a cathedral service look casual. Welcome to the blessed bed ritual, a complex ceremony that turned every medieval marriage bed into a battlefield between good and evil, where priests, herbs, and holy water fought demons, curses, and infertility in what was essentially an exorcism with romance intentions. The preparation began days before the actual wedding. The bedchamber itself had to be spiritually cleansed and prepared, because medieval people believed that evil spirits were particularly attracted to moments of joy and new beginnings. A wedding night was like sending up a signal flare to every demon within 100 miles, practically inviting them to come and ruin the marriage. The first step was always a thorough cleaning of the room, but not just with soap and water. The chamber would be swept with special brooms made from specific woods, usually ash or rowan, which were believed to have protective properties. Every corner had to be cleaned because demons were thought to hide in shadows and dusty places. Once the room was physically clean, the real spiritual preparation could begin. A priest would be summoned to perform the actual blessing ceremony, and this wasn't a simple prayer said over the bed. This was a full-scale religious operation that could take hours and involve multiple clergy members. The priest would start by blessing the room itself, walking around the perimeter while sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers in Latin. The holy water wasn't just ordinary blessed water either. It was often specially prepared for wedding ceremonies, sometimes mixed with blessed salt or wine to make it more powerful against evil influences. But the bed itself received the most attention. The priest would thoroughly soak the mattress, pillows, and sheets with holy water while reciting specific prayers for fertility, protection, and marital happiness. Some priests used so much holy water that the bedding had to be partially dried before the couple could actually use it. The blessing prayers were incredibly detailed and specific. They didn't just ask for general protection and happiness. Medieval wedding bed blessings included prayers for the husband's virility, the wife's fertility, protection against miscarriage, safety during childbirth, and even requests for male heirs. Some prayers went so far as to specify the exact number of children the couple should have. But holy water was just the beginning. The herb component of the blessed bed ritual was equally elaborate and based on centuries of folk wisdom about plants that promoted fertility and love. The most common herbs used were rosemary for remembrance and fidelity, lavender for love and passion, and mint for prosperity and health. These herbs weren't just scattered randomly around the room. They were placed in specific patterns that had symbolic meaning. Rose petals might be arranged in the shape of a cross on the bed to invoke divine protection. Herbs were often sewn into small sachets and hidden under the mattress, where they would release their scents throughout the night. Some regions had incredibly specific herbal requirements. In parts of France, the marriage bed had to include exactly 7 different herbs, each one representing a different aspect of marriage: love, fertility, fidelity, prosperity, health, happiness, and protection. Finding and preparing these herbs could take weeks, and getting even one wrong could supposedly doom the entire marriage. But the most important herb was always fertility-related. Medieval people were obsessed with ensuring that marriages produced children quickly, both for economic reasons and because childless marriages were often seen as cursed or invalid. Common fertility herbs included caraway seeds, which were believed to prevent the couple from growing apart, and fennel, which was thought to increase the wife's chances of conception. The strangest part of the herbal preparation was that many of these herbs had to be gathered at specific times under specific conditions. Some had to be picked at midnight during a full moon. Others had to be collected by a virgin at dawn on the morning of the wedding. Still others had to be blessed by a priest before they could be used in a marriage bed. The demon-banishing aspect of the blessed bed ritual was perhaps the most elaborate part of the entire ceremony. Medieval people believed that demons were particularly interested in disrupting new marriages, either because they were jealous of human happiness or because they wanted to prevent the birth of future Christian children. To combat this threat, priests would perform what was essentially a mini exorcism on the bedchamber. They would command any evil spirits to leave the room in the name of Christ, sometimes shouting the commands loudly enough to be heard throughout the house. They would make the sign of the cross in every corner and over every piece of furniture. Some exorcism rituals involved burning specific incense that was supposed to be particularly offensive to demons. The smoke would fill the room, and the priest would walk through it while reciting prayers and making protective gestures. The couple would sometimes have to wait outside during this part because the spiritual battle was considered too dangerous for them to witness directly. In extreme cases, especially for noble families who could afford it, multiple priests would be involved in the bed blessing ceremony. One priest might focus on the fertility prayers, another on protection from evil, and a third on blessing the physical space. Some royal weddings involved bishops or even archbishops performing the bed blessing, turning it into a major religious ceremony in its own right. The timing of the blessed bed ritual was also crucial. It usually had to be performed on the day of the wedding, after the ceremony, but before the bedding ceremony. Some traditions required it to be done at sunset, when the barrier between the physical and spiritual worlds was believed to be thinnest. Others insisted it had to be completed before midnight, when evil spirits were thought to be most active. For wealthy families, the blessed bed ritual could become incredibly expensive and elaborate. Rare herbs might be imported from distant regions, special holy water might be blessed by multiple priests, and the ceremony itself might involve gold crosses, silver incense burners, and silk banners embroidered with protective prayers. But even poor families felt obligated to perform some version of the blessed bed ritual. They might not be able to afford rare herbs or multiple priests, but they would still sprinkle their bed with blessed water from the local church and scatter whatever protective herbs they could find or grow themselves. The belief in the power of the blessed bed ritual was so strong that skipping it was considered extremely dangerous. Marriages that weren't properly blessed were expected to fail, either through infertility, infidelity, or the husband and wife simply falling out of love. Even worse, unblessed marriages were thought to produce sickly children or no children at all. This created enormous pressure on families to perform the ritual correctly. Mistakes in the ceremony could supposedly have consequences that lasted for generations. If the priest mispronounced a prayer, if the wrong herbs were used, if the holy water wasn't blessed properly, all of these errors could doom not just the marriage but the entire family line. The blessed bed ritual began to decline in the later medieval period as the church became more centralized and standardized. Church authorities started to discourage some of the more elaborate herbal and exorcism elements, viewing them as too close to pagan magic. But the basic practice of blessing marriage beds with holy water continued for centuries. Even today, some traditional wedding ceremonies include elements that trace back to the medieval blessed bed ritual. The use of flowers in wedding decorations, the practice of blessing new homes, and even the tradition of throwing rice at weddings all have roots in medieval beliefs about fertility, protection, and spiritual preparation for marriage. So the next time you see rose petals scattered on a hotel bed for honeymooners, remember that this romantic gesture has its origins in a medieval exorcism designed to protect newlyweds from demons and ensure they produced plenty of children. Medieval romance was apparently equal parts love and spiritual warfare. Number 4. Stockings and garter throwing, medieval foreplay. Just when you think you understand medieval wedding traditions, we stumble onto something that makes modern bachelor and bachelorette parties look tame by comparison. Because in medieval Europe, the moments leading up to the actual bedding weren't just about getting undressed. They were about fertility rituals, lucky charms, and a tradition so wild that pieces of it survived into modern weddings, though most people have no idea what they're actually celebrating. Let me introduce you to the medieval tradition of stocking and garter throwing, a custom that turned the bride's undergarments into magical objects and the wedding guests into a frenzied crowd fighting over what were essentially fertility charms with a very personal touch. Here's how this bizarre tradition worked, and trust me, It's way more intense than anything you've seen at modern weddings. After the bedding ceremony had gotten the couple into their bedchamber, but before they were actually left alone, there was one more ritual that had to be completed. The bride's stockings and garters had to be removed and distributed to the wedding guests as good luck charms. But this wasn't a gentle, romantic moment where the groom carefully removed his new wife's stockings. Oh no, this was a free-for-all that resembled a medieval version of a rock concert mosh pit. Except instead of trying to catch a guitar pick, wedding guests were fighting over intimate apparel. The bride would sit on the edge of the marriage bed, still in her undergarments, while the wedding guests crowded around her. The removal of the stockings and garters was done by the female wedding guests, usually the bride's female relatives or close friends. But here's where it gets wild. The male guests were allowed, even encouraged, to help. Picture this scene. A new bride, barely clothed, sitting on her marriage bed while dozens of wedding guests, both men and women, crowd around her trying to grab pieces of her underwear. The women would work to untie the garters that held up the bride's stockings, while the men would reach in trying to touch the ribbons for luck. It was basically a sanctioned groping session that everyone pretended was a religious ceremony. The garters themselves were special items, not just practical undergarments. Medieval brides wore elaborate garters made of silk ribbons, often in bright colors like blue or red, and decorated with flowers, herbs, or small charms. These garters weren't hidden under the dress. They were worn visibly on the legs, just above the knee, specifically so they could be seen and admired by wedding guests. The most valuable garters were those that had been blessed by a priest or had been worn by other successful wives. Some families had heirloom garters that were passed down from mother to daughter, accumulating luck and power with each successful marriage. Getting your hands on one of these super-powered garters was like winning the medieval lottery of fertility magic. But removing the garters was just the first part of the tradition. Once they were untied from the bride's legs, they had to be thrown to the crowd of guests, and this is where things got really chaotic. The guests would form a mob around the bed, pushing and shoving to position themselves for the best chance of catching a garter. Men and women would literally fight each other for these scraps of intimate clothing. The person who caught a garter was believed to gain incredible luck in love and fertility. Single guests thought that catching a garter would help them find a spouse quickly. Married guests believed it would increase their own fertility or improve their marriage. Even elderly guests would fight for garters, thinking they might bring health and longevity. The stockings received similar treatment, though the ritual was slightly different. After the garters were removed, the bride's stockings would be peeled off, often by multiple people pulling at once. The stockings would then be cut into pieces so that more guests could have a fragment of the lucky cloth. Some particularly aggressive guests would try to grab the stockings right off the bride's feet, leading to what can only be described as medieval underwear wrestling. But here's the really bizarre part. The garters and stockings weren't just kept as good luck charms. They were supposed to be used in specific ways to maximize their magical power. Single women would wear pieces of the bride's garters under their own clothes, believing it would help them attract husbands. Married women would place fragments of the stockings under their own marriage beds to increase fertility. Some guests would even eat small pieces of the ribbons or cloth, thinking that consuming part of the bride's intimate apparel would transfer her fertility to them. This practice was especially common among women who had been trying unsuccessfully to conceive, and it was considered perfectly normal behavior at medieval weddings. The tradition had regional variations that were somehow even stranger. In parts of Germany, the bride's shoes were also considered lucky charms, and guests would fight over the laces and buckles. In France, pieces of the bride's shift, the medieval equivalent of a slip, were distributed along with the garters and stockings. Some English traditions included the bride's hair ribbons in the distribution, though these were considered less powerful than the leg garments. The timing of the stocking and garter throwing was crucial. It had to happen after the bedding ceremony, but before the couple was left alone for consummation. This narrow window meant that the entire ritual had to be completed quickly, which added to the frenzied atmosphere. Guests knew they only had a few minutes to grab their lucky charms before being kicked out of the bedchamber. For noble families, the stocking and garter throwing could become extremely elaborate and expensive affairs. Royal brides might wear dozens of garters, each one made of precious materials like silk, silver thread, or even gold wire. The distribution of these valuable items became a way of showing favor to important guests and cementing political alliances. Some royal weddings had specific protocols for who could receive which garters. The most valuable ones might be reserved for foreign ambassadors or high-ranking nobles, while lesser garters would be thrown to the general crowd. Getting a royal garter was considered such an honor that recipients would often display them prominently in their homes or even have them incorporated into their family coat of arms. The tradition was so ingrained in medieval wedding culture that skipping it was considered bad luck for the marriage. Brides who refused to participate in the stocking and garter throwing were seen as selfish or possibly cursed. Even worse, their marriages were expected to fail because the community hadn't been able to share in the fertility magic. This created pressure on brides to participate even when they found the tradition embarrassing or invasive. Some brides tried to compromise by wearing extra layers of stockings so they could keep some garments private while still satisfying the crowd's demands for lucky charms. Others would wear special sacrifice garters that were designed specifically to be thrown to guests, keeping their actual functional undergarments intact. The tradition began to evolve and become less invasive over time, partly due to changing attitudes about modesty and partly because of church pressure to reduce the sexual elements of wedding ceremonies. By the late medieval period, some communities allowed the groom to remove and throw the garters instead of having the entire crowd participate in undressing the bride. This evolution eventually led to the modern tradition of the groom removing the bride's garter and throwing it to the male wedding guests, while the bride throws her bouquet to the single women. Most people today have no idea that this civilized modern custom has its roots in a medieval free-for-all, where wedding guests would literally fight each other for pieces of the bride's underwear. The belief in the power of wedding garters was so strong that it created an entire secondary market in medieval Europe. Professional garter makers specialized in creating elaborate wedding garters that would be impressive enough to satisfy demanding wedding guests. Some unscrupulous vendors would even sell pre-blessed garters that claimed to have extra fertility power, though these were often just regular ribbons that had been sprinkled with holy water. So the next time you're at a wedding and you see the groom gently removing his bride's garter and politely tossing it to a crowd of civilized guests, remember the medieval origins of this tradition. What you're witnessing is the highly sanitized descendant of a medieval fertility riot where dozens of people would fight over intimate clothing while the bride sat nearly naked on her marriage bed. Modern weddings are definitely an improvement. Number 5. The shoe over shoulder test. Medieval people had some truly bizarre ways of predicting the future, from reading entrails to interpreting cloud formations. But perhaps no medieval tradition combined superstition, marriage politics, and pure physical comedy, quite like the shoe over shoulder test, a wedding night ritual that determined everything from who would rule the household to how many children the couple would have, all based on where a piece of footwear happened to land. This wasn't some quick, casual toss of a slipper. The shoe over shoulder test was a formal ceremony with specific rules, elaborate preparations, and consequences that could affect the entire course of a marriage. And unlike many other medieval wedding traditions that were performed by the community, this one put all the pressure squarely on the bride herself. Here's how this bizarre tradition worked. And trust me, the medieval mind's ability to find deep meaning in random events will amaze you. After the bedding ceremony and the stocking and garter throwing, but before the couple was finally left alone, the bride had to perform one final test that would supposedly reveal the secrets of her future marriage. The bride would stand at the foot of the marriage bed, facing away from her husband and the assembled wedding guests. She would remove one of her shoes, typically the right shoe because the right side was considered luckier and more powerful in medieval superstition. This shoe had to be the one she had worn during the wedding ceremony, not a special ceremonial shoe, because it needed to carry the spiritual energy of the marriage vows. The removal of the shoe was itself part of the ritual. The bride couldn't just slip it off casually. She had to bend down and unlace or unbuckle the shoe completely while reciting a prayer or blessing, usually something asking for divine guidance in her marriage. Some traditions required her to kiss the shoe before throwing it, blessing it with her lips and breath. Once the shoe was properly prepared, the bride would hold it in her right hand, close her eyes, and throw it backwards over her right shoulder without looking. The throw had to be done blind, because any attempt to aim or control where the shoe landed would invalidate the entire prophecy. The bride had to trust in fate, or divine will, to guide the shoe to the right spot. But here's where the medieval obsession with symbolism really went wild. Every possible landing spot for the shoe had a different meaning, and wedding guests would crowd around to see exactly where it fell. The interpretations were incredibly detailed and specific, passed down through generations of wedding traditions. If the shoe landed pointing toward the head of the bed, it meant the wife would be the dominant partner in the marriage. She would control the household finances, make the important decisions, and generally rule over her husband. This was considered moderately good luck because it suggested the wife would be strong and capable, but it also meant the husband might be seen as weak. If the shoe landed pointing toward the foot of the bed, it meant the husband would be the dominant partner, which was considered the ideal outcome in medieval society. The wife would be obedient and submissive, the husband would be a strong leader, and the household would follow traditional gender roles. This was the result most families hoped for. But the direction wasn't the only important factor. The distance the shoe traveled also carried meaning. A shoe that landed close to the bed meant the couple would have a close, intimate marriage with many children. A shoe that flew far from the bed suggested the couple might grow apart over time or have difficulty conceiving children. If the shoe landed upright, still in a position where it could be worn, it was considered excellent luck. It meant the marriage would be stable, prosperous, and long-lasting. But if the shoe landed upside down or on its side, it was a bad omen suggesting trouble ahead. Some interpretations claim that an upside-down shoe predicted the death of one spouse within a year of marriage. The most detailed interpretations came from reading the exact position and orientation of the shoe. A shoe that landed with its toe pointing toward the door meant the wife would be unfaithful or that one spouse would leave the other. A shoe pointing toward the window suggested the couple would travel extensively or live far from their families. A shoe that bounced under the bed was considered terrible luck, predicting either infertility or the early death of children. But perhaps the most important aspect of the shoe throwing was predicting the number of children the couple would have. This was determined by counting the number of times the shoe bounced or rolled after landing. Each bounce represented one child. So a shoe that bounced 3 times meant 3 children, while a shoe that landed without bouncing meant the couple would remain childless. Some regions had even more elaborate counting systems. In parts of France, the number of children was predicted by counting the number of eyelets or buckles visible on the shoe after it landed. German traditions sometimes involved measuring the distance from the shoe to the bed in handspans, with each span representing a year until the first child would be born. The shoe-over-shoulder test created enormous pressure on medieval brides because everyone believed the results were divinely ordained and couldn't be changed. A bride whose shoe predicted a bad marriage or no children would be pitted and possibly blamed for bringing bad luck to the union. Families sometimes delayed the wedding night for days if the shoe test results were particularly ominous, hoping that prayers and additional blessings might change the outcome. This led to some creative attempts to influence the results. Some brides would practice throwing shoes in private before their wedding, trying to develop a technique that would produce favorable results. Others would wear specially weighted shoes that were more likely to land upright or travel the right distance. A few desperate families even hired professional shoe throwers, usually older women who claimed to have the skill to make shoes land in lucky positions. The church had a complicated relationship with the shoe throwing tradition. Some priests condemned it as superstition and refused to allow it during Christian weddings. Others embraced it as a way of seeking divine guidance for the new marriage. A few creative clergy members even incorporated the shoe throwing into the official wedding ceremony, having the bride throw the shoe immediately after taking her vows. The tradition was so widespread that it created an entire industry around wedding shoes. Specialized shoemakers would craft wedding shoes designed specifically for the throwing ceremony. These shoes were lighter than regular footwear, so they would fly farther, but they were also decorated with special symbols and charms that were supposed to increase their prophetic power. The most expensive wedding shoes were those that had been previously owned by women who had successful marriages and many children. These lucky shoes could cost more than most families earned in a month, but they were considered good investments because they supposedly guaranteed favorable results in the throwing test. Some families even kept collections of successful wedding shoes, lending them out to other families or renting them for important marriages. The most famous lucky shoes might be used in dozens of weddings over the course of several decades, accumulating power and reputation with each successful marriage they predicted. But the shoe-throwing tradition also created social problems. Families whose daughters' shoes predicted bad outcomes would sometimes blame the shoemaker, claiming that the shoes had been cursed or improperly made. This led to lawsuits, feuds, and even violence between families and craftsmen. The tradition began to decline in the later medieval period as attitudes towards superstition changed and the church became more skeptical of non-Christian wedding practices. But it persisted in some rural areas well into the Renaissance, and traces of it can still be found in some modern wedding traditions. The practice of throwing the bride's bouquet, for example, is thought by some historians to be a descendant of the shoe-throwing tradition. The idea that catching the bouquet will bring good luck and love is remarkably similar to medieval beliefs about catching pieces of the bride's clothing or accessories. So the next time you see a bride throw her bouquet at a wedding, remember that this innocent modern tradition has its roots in a medieval practice where the bride's shoe was believed to reveal the deepest secrets of her future marriage, and where the wrong bounce could doom a couple to a lifetime of unhappiness. Number 6. Communal soup drinking. The aphrodisiac feast. If you thought medieval wedding traditions were weird so far, wait until you hear about what medieval couples were expected to eat and drink on their wedding night. Because in medieval Europe, preparing for consummation wasn't just about spiritual blessings and lucky charms. It was also about consuming the most bizarre, disgusting, and allegedly powerful aphrodisiac soup that human imagination could devise. Welcome to the world of medieval wedding night cuisine, where animal testicles met mystical herbs, where entire communities gathered to watch newlyweds consume fertility potions, and where the line between medicine and magic disappeared entirely in a bowl of very questionable soup. The tradition of communal soup drinking was based on medieval beliefs about food, fertility, and sexual performance. Medieval people thought that you could literally eat your way to better sex and higher fertility by consuming foods that resembled sexual organs or that had reputations for increasing desire. This wasn't subtle symbolism. This was full-blown medieval logic that said if it looks like a penis or comes from near reproductive organs, it must make you more virile. The centerpiece of every medieval wedding night feast was the fertility soup, and the main ingredient was always animal testicles. Not just any testicles. The bigger and more virile the animal, the more powerful the soup was supposed to be. Bull testicles were the gold standard, considered the most potent ingredient for increasing male sexual performance. But depending on the region and what was available, the soup might include testicles from rams, boars, stallions, or even roosters. The preparation of the soup was a community event that began days before the wedding. The testicles had to be fresh, ideally harvested from young, healthy animals on the morning of the wedding day. The task of castrating the animals and preparing the testicles was usually given to the oldest, most experienced women in the community, because they were thought to have the knowledge needed to preserve the sexual power of the organs. But testicles were just the beginning. The soup also included an incredible variety of herbs and spices that were believed to have aphrodisiac properties. Ginseng root was highly prized, but it was expensive and hard to find. So most communities used local substitutes like mandrake root, which was thought to increase fertility because of its vaguely human shape. Other common ingredients included horny goat weed, which got its name from goat herders who noticed that goats became more sexually active after eating it. Damiana was added for female fertility, while tribulus was included to increase male testosterone. Some recipes called for powdered rhinoceros horn or tiger bone, though these were so expensive that only royal families could afford them. The strangest ingredients were those chosen purely for symbolic reasons. Pine nuts were included because they came from trees that stayed green all year, symbolizing eternal fertility. Pomegranate seeds were added because the fruit had so many seeds, representing the hope for many children. Even the cooking process was symbolic. The soup had to be simmered for exactly 9 hours, representing the 9 months of pregnancy. The herbs weren't just thrown into the pot randomly. Each ingredient had to be added at a specific time and in a specific order, while reciting prayers or incantations that were supposed to activate their aphrodisiac properties. Some recipes required the cook to stir the soup clockwise while chanting fertility blessings, turning the kitchen into what was essentially a witch's cauldron with a marriage license. But here's where the tradition gets really weird. The soup wasn't just consumed by the bride and groom. The entire wedding party, and sometimes the whole community, would gather to drink the fertility soup together. This wasn't a private romantic dinner. It was a public consumption of aphrodisiac that everyone participated in. The communal drinking usually took place in the great hall or main room of the house where the wedding was being held. Large cauldrons of the soup would be prepared, and everyone would line up with their bowls to receive a portion. The bride and groom would go first, drinking from special ceremonial cups that had been blessed by the priest, but then everyone else would join in. The reasoning behind the communal consumption was that fertility was considered a community blessing, not just a personal one. By sharing the aphrodisiac soup, all the married couples in the community would supposedly benefit from increased fertility and improved sexual performance. It was like a medieval Viagra party where everyone was invited. The taste of this soup was, by all accounts, absolutely horrible. Medieval recipes that survive today describe flavors that would make a modern person gag. The testicles created a strong, gamey flavor that was barely masked by the herbs and spices. The texture was described as chewy and rubbery, with chunks of organ meat floating in a broth that was often thick and oily from animal fat. But taste wasn't the point, power was. Medieval people believed that the more disgusting the medicine, the more effective it must be. If the fertility soup tasted good, it obviously wasn't working hard enough to improve your sexual performance. The fact that it was revolting was actually seen as proof that it was packed with potent aphrodisiac energy. The drinking of the soup was accompanied by increasingly crude toasts and jokes from the wedding guests. As the alcohol in the soup took effect, many recipes included wine or ale. The crowd would become more boisterous, and the suggestions about what the bride and groom should do that night would become more explicit. It was basically a medieval roast where everyone got drunk on aphrodisiac soup and told sex jokes. Some regions had competitive elements to the soup drinking. Men would compete to see who could drink the most soup, believing that consuming larger quantities would make them more virile. Women might compete to see who could identify the most herbs by taste, demonstrating their knowledge of fertility magic. These competitions often became rowdy events that could last for hours. The most elaborate soup drinking ceremonies occurred at noble weddings, where the ingredients were more exotic and expensive. Royal wedding soups might include rare spices imported from Asia, powdered pearls for their supposed aphrodisiac properties, or even small amounts of gold flakes because gold was considered the most perfect metal and therefore beneficial for fertility. Some noble families hired professional soup makers, specialists who claimed to know secret recipes that had been passed down through generations of successful marriages. These experts would travel from wedding to wedding, carrying collections of rare herbs and claiming that their soups were more potent than anyone else's. The church had an ambivalent relationship with the soup drinking tradition. Some priests condemned it as pagan superstition and refused to bless ingredients that were clearly being used for magical purposes. But other clergy members embraced the tradition, arguing that God had provided herbs and animals for human benefit, including the benefit of marital fertility. This tension led to some creative compromises. Some priests would bless the soup after it was cooked, but before the herbs were identified, allowing them to support the general idea of seeking God's help for fertility while avoiding endorsement of specific magical practices. Other priests would attend the soup drinking but would drink only broth without any of the organ meat, maintaining their spiritual purity while still participating in the community celebration. The belief in the power of aphrodisiac soup was so strong that couples who couldn't afford elaborate ingredients would sometimes go into debt to purchase them. Families would save money for months to buy bull testicles and exotic herbs for their children's weddings, believing that skimping on the soup would doom the marriage to infertility. This created opportunities for fraud and exploitation. Unscrupulous merchants would sell fake aphrodisiac ingredients to desperate families, passing off regular herbs as expensive fertility enhancers or selling sheep testicles as more expensive bull organs. Some vendors would even sell pre-blessed ingredients that claimed to have extra potency, though these were often just regular ingredients that had been sprinkled with holy water. The tradition began to decline in the later medieval period as medical knowledge improved and people became more skeptical of folk remedies. The development of more sophisticated understanding of human reproduction made the testicular soup seem less plausible as a fertility treatment. But the practice persisted in some rural areas for centuries, and traces of it can still be found in traditional wedding customs around the world. The practice of serving special wedding cakes, for example, may have evolved from the tradition of sharing fertility foods with the entire wedding community. Even the modern tradition of toasting the bride and groom has roots in the communal consumption of wedding night aphrodisiacs. The idea that sharing special drinks will bring good luck to a marriage is remarkably similar to medieval beliefs about the power of fertility soup. So the next time you raise a glass to toast newlyweds at a wedding reception, remember that this civilized modern custom evolved from a medieval tradition where entire communities would gather to consume bowls of animal testicle soup while making increasingly crude jokes about what the couple should do in bed that night. Modern wedding receptions are definitely more appetizing. Number 7. The shirt test, proving virginity. Medieval society was obsessed with female virginity in ways that would make modern people extremely uncomfortable. But perhaps no medieval tradition combined this obsession with invasive examination, family drama, and creative fraud quite like the shirt test, a morning-after ritual that turned a piece of clothing into evidence in what was essentially a public trial about the bride's purity and the groom's performance. The shirt test was based on the medieval belief that a woman's virginity could be proven by physical evidence left on her clothing during her first sexual experience. This wasn't just about moral judgment. It was about legal and economic consequences that could affect entire families. A bride who couldn't pass the shirt test might be returned to her family in disgrace, while a family that provided a non-virgin bride could face financial penalties or even violence. Here's how this invasive and traumatic tradition worked, and trust me, it reveals everything you need to know about medieval attitudes toward women, sexuality, and privacy. The shirt in question was the bride's chemise or shift, the medieval equivalent of a modern slip or nightgown. This was the innermost garment that the bride wore under her other clothes, and it was the piece of clothing that would supposedly collect evidence of her lost virginity during the wedding night consummation. The preparation for the shirt test actually began before the wedding ceremony. The bride's family would carefully select and prepare a special white chemise that would be worn only on the wedding night. This garment had to be made of the finest white linen available, because any color or pattern might interfere with the visibility of bloodstains that were expected to appear. The chemise was often blessed by a priest before the wedding, not just for spiritual protection, but to ensure that it would provide accurate evidence of virginity. Some families would even have multiple witnesses observe the preparation of the chemise, documenting that it was clean, white, and free of any existing stains that might confuse the results of the morning after examination. On the wedding night, after all the other ceremonies were complete and the couple was finally left alone, the bride was expected to wear this special chemise during consummation. The garment was supposed to collect bloodstains that medieval people believed always resulted from a virgin's first sexual experience. These stains would serve as proof that the bride had indeed been pure and that the marriage had been properly consummated. But the real drama began the morning after the wedding night. As soon as the couple woke up, usually at dawn, the examination process would begin. This wasn't a private moment between husband and wife. It was a community event that involved multiple family members and sometimes even official witnesses. The bride's female relatives, typically including her mother, aunts, and older married sisters, would enter the bedchamber to collect the chemise for examination. The bride would have to remove the garment in front of these women, who would immediately begin inspecting it for the telltale bloodstains that would prove her virginity. The examination was incredibly detailed and humiliating. The women would spread the chemise out on a table or bed where it could be seen clearly in daylight. Every inch of the fabric would be scrutinized, with particular attention paid to the areas that would have been in contact with the bride's genital area during intercourse. The examiners weren't just looking for the presence of blood, they were looking for specific types of stains in specific locations. The blood had to be fresh, indicating that it came from the wedding night rather than from menstruation or some other source. It had to be located in the right places on the chemise, proving that it resulted from penetration rather than from some other injury. The amount of blood was also important. Too little blood might suggest that the bride wasn't actually a virgin, while too much blood could indicate injury or violence rather than normal defloration. The examiners had to make judgments about whether the stains looked right according to their understanding of female anatomy and sexual experience. If the examination was successful, if the chemise showed the expected bloodstains in the expected places, the results would be announced to the gathered family members and wedding guests. The bride would be officially declared to have been a virgin, the marriage would be validated, and both families could proceed with the post-wedding celebrations and legal arrangements. But if the examination failed, if there were no bloodstains, or if the stains looked suspicious, the consequences could be devastating. The bride might be accused of having lied about her virginity, the marriage might be declared invalid, and both families could face social and financial ruin. The failed shirt test could lead to immediate annulment of the marriage, with the bride being returned to her family in disgrace. The bride's family might be required to return the dowry they had received, and they might face additional financial penalties for providing a non-virgin bride. In extreme cases, the bride herself might face physical punishment or even banishment from the community. This high-stakes nature of the shirt test led to widespread fraud and manipulation. Families who knew their daughters weren't virgins would go to extraordinary lengths to fake the evidence needed to pass the examination. The most common method of fraud was to use animal blood to create fake virginity stains on the chemise. Chicken blood was the most popular choice because it was readily available and had a color and consistency similar to human menstrual blood. The blood would be applied to the chemise either before the wedding night or early in the morning before the examination. Some families would hide small bladders or sponges filled with blood in the bride's clothing or in the marriage bed so that they could be crushed during intercourse to create the appearance of natural bleeding. More sophisticated fraudsters would use special herbs or chemicals that would create red stains when mixed with bodily fluids. The most elaborate fraud schemes involved bribing or threatening the examiners themselves. Families might pay the bride's female relatives to report false results, or they might arrange for sympathetic witnesses to conduct the examination instead of more objective parties. But the fraud went both ways. Families who wanted to get out of an unwanted marriage might deliberately sabotage the shirt test, claiming that the bride wasn't a virgin even when she was. They might plant fake evidence of previous sexual activity or bribe examiners to report negative results. The shirt test also created opportunities for blackmail and manipulation within families. Relatives who knew about fraud attempts might demand money or favors in exchange for their silence. Knowledge about a bride's actual sexual history became a form of currency that could be traded for political or economic advantage. Some regions developed more sophisticated testing methods to combat fraud. In parts of Italy, the chemise examination was supplemented by physical examination of the bride by experienced midwives who claimed they could detect virginity by examining the hymen. These examinations were even more invasive and traumatic than the shirt test, but they were considered more reliable evidence. The church had a complicated relationship with the shirt test. Some religious authorities supported it as a way of ensuring that Christian marriages were pure and legitimate. But other church leaders condemned it as an invasive practice that treated women like property rather than as human beings created in God's image. This religious tension led to regional variations in how the shirt test was conducted. In areas where the church opposed the practice, it might be conducted secretly by families without official religious sanction. In regions where the church supported it, priests might even participate in the examination process or bless the results. The shirt test began to decline in the later medieval period as medical knowledge improved and people began to understand that not all women bleed during their first sexual experience. The development of more sophisticated marriage laws also reduced the legal importance of proving virginity, making the shirt test less necessary for validating marriages. But the practice persisted in some areas well into the modern era, and traces of it can still be found in some traditional cultures around the world. The basic idea that women's sexual purity can and should be physically verified remains a persistent element of patriarchal societies. The legacy of the shirt test is a reminder of how medieval society treated women's bodies as public property subject to community examination and judgment. It shows how the most intimate aspects of marriage were considered matters of public concern rather than private experience. So the next time you hear someone romanticizing medieval times or talking about how much simpler life was back then, remember the shirt test. Remember the medieval brides who had to face public examination of their most intimate clothing, who had to prove their worth as wives through bloodstains on fabric, and who lived in a society where a piece of underwear could determine the entire course of their lives. Number 8. Breaking bread over bodies. Fertility magic. Medieval fertility rituals could get incredibly strange, but perhaps none were quite as bizarre as the practice of breaking bread over the bodies of sleeping newlyweds. This wasn't just about sharing food or blessing a meal. This was full-scale fertility magic that turned the marriage bed into an altar and wedding guests into participants in what was essentially a communion service with very intimate undertones. The bread-breaking ritual was based on medieval beliefs about the transfer of fertility power through food, proximity, and ritual action. Medieval people thought that fertility was a kind of magical energy that could be shared, transferred, and amplified through the right combination of blessed food, physical closeness, and community participation. And they believed that this energy was most powerful when it was performed over the bodies of people who were in the process of creating new life. Here's how this surreal tradition worked, and trust me, it makes modern wedding cake cutting look incredibly tame by comparison. The ritual typically took place on the morning after the wedding night, after the couple had consummated their marriage, but while they were still in bed together. The timing was crucial. The bread had to be broken while the couple was still physically connected to the sexual energy of their wedding night, but late enough in the morning that the community could gather to participate in the ceremony. The bread itself wasn't ordinary bread. It was specially prepared fertility bread that had been baked with specific ingredients that were believed to promote conception and healthy childbirth. The most common additions were caraway seeds, which were thought to prevent the couple from growing apart, and fennel seeds, which were believed to increase female fertility. The dough for the fertility bread was often mixed with blessed water, wine that had been consecrated by a priest, or even small amounts of holy oil. Some recipes called for the bread to be shaped into specific fertility symbols, braided to represent the intertwining of two lives, formed into circles to represent the eternal nature of marriage, or shaped like phalluses and wombs for more obvious symbolic reasons. The preparation of the fertility bread was usually done by the oldest and most fertile women in the community, because they were thought to be able to transfer their own reproductive success into the bread through their touch and breath. These women would recite prayers or fertility chants while kneading the dough, and they would often share stories of their own successful pregnancies to further bless the bread with fertile energy. On the morning of the ritual, the wedding guests would gather quietly in the bedchamber while the couple was still asleep. The goal was to perform the bread-breaking ceremony without waking the newlyweds, because disturbing their rest was thought to interfere with the fertility magic that was still working in their bodies from the previous night's consummation. The couple would be lying in bed together, ideally still naked or wearing minimal clothing, because direct contact with their skin was believed to be necessary for the fertility transfer to work properly. The wedding guests would surround the bed, trying to get as close as possible to the sleeping couple without actually touching them. The fertility bread would then be held directly over the couple's bodies, usually positioned above their abdomens where any future children would grow. The person designated to break the bread, typically the oldest fertile woman in the community, would recite a prayer or incantation asking for the couple to be blessed with many healthy children. The breaking of the bread had to be done in a specific way. It couldn't be cut with a knife, because metal tools were thought to interfere with fertility magic. It couldn't be torn roughly, because violent actions might harm the couple's reproductive potential. Instead, the bread had to be gently broken by hand into pieces that would be distributed to all the participants in the ceremony. But here's where the ritual gets really weird. The bread pieces weren't just handed out to the wedding guests. They were dropped directly onto the couple's bodies, particularly onto their abdomens and genital areas, where they would supposedly absorb the fertility energy radiating from the newlywed skin. The sleeping couple would gradually become covered with pieces of blessed bread, turning them into human fertility altars. The wedding guests would then carefully collect the bread pieces that had been in contact with the couple's bodies. These bread fragments were considered incredibly powerful fertility charms, infused with the sexual energy of the newlyweds and the blessing power of the ritual bread. Each guest would take several pieces, eating some immediately, and saving others for later use. The bread that was eaten immediately was supposed to transfer some of the couple's fertility to the person consuming it. Married couples who were having difficulty conceiving would eat as many pieces as possible, believing that the blessed bread would help them get pregnant. Single guests would eat the bread hoping that it would help them find spouses and start families of their own. The bread pieces that were saved were used as ongoing fertility charms. Some people would keep them under their own marriage beds, believing that proximity to the fertility-charged bread would improve their own sex lives and reproductive success. Others would crumble the saved bread into their food over the course of several weeks, gradually consuming the fertility magic to maximize its effects. Some families would even preserve pieces of the fertility bread for years, using them as ingredients in future fertility rituals or giving them to children and grandchildren who were getting married. The most powerful bread pieces, those that had been in direct contact with the newlyweds' genital areas, might be passed down through generations as family fertility heirlooms. The ritual wasn't complete until the couple woke up and discovered what had happened. Their reaction was considered an important omen for their future fertility. If they woke up laughing and seemed amused by being covered with breadcrumbs, it was a sign that they would have many children and a happy marriage. If they seemed angry or embarrassed, it might indicate fertility problems or marital difficulties ahead. The couple was then expected to participate in the final part of the ritual by eating some of the remaining bread themselves. This was supposed to complete the fertility magic circle, ensuring that the power that had been transferred from their bodies into the bread would return to them multiplied by the community's blessings. Regional variations of the bread-breaking ritual could be even more elaborate. In some parts of France, the fertility bread was shaped into small dolls representing future children, and the number of doll-shaped breads broken over the couple's bodies was supposed to predict how many children they would have. German traditions sometimes involved breaking different types of bread over different parts of the couple's bodies. Rye bread over the woman's womb, wheat bread over the man's groin, and barley bread over both their hearts. The most elaborate versions of the ritual involved multiple rounds of bread breaking, with different types of fertility bread being used at different times of the morning. The first round might use bread made with herbs for female fertility. The second round might feature bread designed to increase male virility, and the third round might involve bread blessed specifically for the health and safety of future children. Some communities combined the bread-breaking ritual with other fertility practices. The breadcrumbs that fell onto the bed sheets might be mixed with herbs and sewn into small sachets that the couple would keep under their mattress. The crumbs that fell on the floor might be swept up and scattered in the couple's garden, where they were supposed to make the soil more fertile and productive. The church's attitude toward the bread-breaking ritual was typically disapproving, since it involved a combination of pagan fertility magic and what could be seen as a parody of Christian communion. Most priests refused to bless fertility bread or participate in the ritual, viewing it as superstitious nonsense that distracted from proper Christian approaches to marriage and family. But the practice was so popular and deeply ingrained in community traditions that it was difficult for religious authorities to suppress completely. Some priests compromised by offering to bless regular bread that could then be used in fertility rituals, allowing them to provide spiritual support for the community's desires while avoiding endorsement of the more magical aspects of the practice. The bread-breaking ritual began to decline in the later medieval period as the church became more successful in suppressing pagan practices and as people became more concerned about privacy and modesty in marriage customs. The idea of having wedding guests perform rituals over sleeping newlyweds gradually came to seem invasive rather than helpful, but traces of the tradition survived in various forms. The modern practice of feeding wedding cake to each other may be a distant descendant of medieval fertility bread rituals. The tradition of saving the top layer of wedding cake to eat on the first anniversary might have roots in the medieval practice of preserving blessed bread as ongoing fertility charms. Even the custom of throwing rice or grain at newlyweds has similarities to the bread-breaking ritual, representing the community's desire to bless the couple with fertility and abundance. The main difference is that modern traditions allow the couple to remain clothed and conscious during the blessing process. So the next time you see a bride and groom cutting their wedding cake together, remember that this sweet modern tradition has its roots in a medieval practice where wedding guests would cover sleeping newlyweds with fertility breadcrumbs while performing magic spells over their naked bodies. Modern wedding receptions are definitely more dignified, if perhaps less magically powerful. Number 9. The chivalry, when the community disapproves. Medieval communities had many ways of expressing approval for marriages they liked, as we've seen with blessing ceremonies and fertility rituals. But what happened when a community disapproved of a marriage? Enter the chivalry, a tradition so disruptive, so deliberately obnoxious, and so emotionally devastating that it could turn a couple's wedding night into a waking nightmare that lasted for days or even weeks. The chivalry wasn't just disapproval. It was psychological warfare conducted with pots, pans, and the coordinated effort of an entire community determined to make a couple's life miserable until they either conformed to social expectations or paid a hefty fine to make the harassment stop. The word chivalry comes from a Latin term meaning headache, which tells you pretty much everything you need to know about what this tradition was designed to accomplish. It was also known by other names in different regions: rough music in England, katze music in Germany, and scampanata in Italy. But the basic concept was the same everywhere. Make as much noise as possible outside the couple's home until they submitted to community pressure. But chivalry wasn't just random harassment. It was a highly organized social punishment that followed specific rules and traditions, with its own rituals, hierarchy, and economic system. Communities that organized chivalry weren't just being mean. They were enforcing social norms through collective action, using shame and exhaustion as tools to maintain their vision of proper marriage customs. So what kinds of marriages triggered chivalry? The list was long and revealed everything about medieval social prejudices and anxieties. The most common target was marriages with large age gaps, especially older men marrying much younger women or older women marrying younger men. These relationships were seen as unnatural and potentially exploitative, deserving of community intervention. Second marriages, especially by widows and widowers, were also frequent targets of chivalry. Medieval communities believed that people should mourn their deceased spouses for specific periods of time before remarrying, and couples who remarried too quickly would face organized harassment. The definition of too quickly varied, but it could be anywhere from 6 months to several years after the death of the first spouse. Cross-class marriages were another major trigger for chivalry. When a peasant married someone from a higher social class, or when a noble married beneath their station, the community might organize chivalry to express their disapproval of the disruption to the social order. These protests could be particularly violent and long-lasting, because they touched on deep anxieties about social mobility and class boundaries. Marriages that bypassed normal courtship customs were also targets. If a couple eloped without their family's permission, if they married without proper community involvement, or if they seemed to be rushing into marriage for suspicious reasons, they might face chivalry as punishment for violating social expectations about how marriages should be conducted. But the most vicious chivalry were reserved for marriages that the community suspected involved adultery, domestic abuse, or other forms of marital misconduct. If a married person left their spouse to marry someone else, if there were rumors of physical violence in the relationship, or if the marriage seemed to be based on deception or coercion, the chivalry could become a form of vigilante justice that lasted for months. The organization of chivalry followed specific social hierarchies and traditions. The event was usually organized by young unmarried men in the community because they were seen as having the most interest in maintaining proper marriage customs that would eventually affect their own romantic prospects. These organizers would plan the chivalry like a military campaign, assigning roles, gathering supplies, and coordinating timing to maximize the impact on the targeted couple. The chivalry typically began at sunset on the couple's wedding night, just when they were hoping to finally be left alone after all the other wedding ceremonies. The organizers would gather outside the couple's home with an arsenal of noise-making devices designed to be as annoying and disruptive as possible. The most common instruments were pots, pans, and metal tools that could be banged together to create discordant, rhythmic noise that would be impossible to ignore or sleep through. Participants would also bring horns, drums, bells, and anything else that could produce loud, jarring sounds. Some communities had special chivalry instruments, oversized cowbells, metal sheets that could be shaken to create thunder-like noise, or wooden clappers that produced sharp, repetitive sounds. But the chivalry wasn't just random noise. It followed specific musical patterns and included songs, chants, and rhymes that mocked the couple and explained why the community disapproved of their marriage. These songs were often incredibly crude and personal, mentioning intimate details about the couple's relationship, their physical appearances, their families, and their suspected motivations for marrying. The lyrics of chivalrous songs could be devastating in their cruelty. They might mock an older man's sexual performance, ridicule a woman's appearance, or suggest that the marriage was based on greed rather than love. The songs were designed to be memorable and humiliating, creating lasting shame that would follow the couple long after the chivalry ended. The chivalry participants would also engage in theatrical performances outside the couple's home, acting out skits that mocked their relationship. These performances might include actors dressed as the bride and groom, exaggerating their physical characteristics or imitating their behavior in insulting ways. Some chivalry included mock wedding ceremonies where actors would parody the couple's actual wedding, making jokes about their vows and predicting disaster for their marriage. The noise and performances would continue all night, making it impossible for the couple to consummate their marriage or get any sleep. But the chivalry didn't end at sunrise. It would resume the next evening and continue night after night until the couple either gave in to the community's demands or found some other way to make it stop. During the day, chivalry participants would often continue their harassment in more subtle ways. They might follow the couple around town making jokes, refuse to do business with them, or spread rumors about their relationship. Children would be encouraged to throw mud or garbage at the couple's house, and neighbors might refuse to speak to them or acknowledge their marriage. The economic impact of chivalry could be devastating. Couples who were being subjected to organized harassment might find it difficult to work, conduct business, or maintain normal relationships with their neighbors. Merchants might refuse to sell them goods, employers might fire them, and landlords might evict them, all as part of the community's coordinated campaign to force them to conform or leave town. The only way to stop chivalry was to pay what was essentially extortion money to the organizers. The couple would have to negotiate with the leaders of the harassment campaign, agreeing to pay a fine in exchange for being left alone. These fines could be enormous, sometimes equivalent to months or even years of income, and they were often accompanied by demands that the couple also provide food and drink for a community feast where everyone would celebrate the end of the chivalry. Some couples tried to resist chivalry through legal action, appealing to local authorities or church officials for protection. But these appeals were often unsuccessful because many community leaders either supported the chivalry or were afraid to oppose it. In some cases, local officials would even participate in the harassment, seeing it as a legitimate way of enforcing community standards. The most desperate couples would simply flee their communities, abandoning their homes and businesses to escape the constant harassment. But even this didn't always work, because chivalry organizers would sometimes send messages to neighboring communities, warning them about the inappropriate marriage and requesting that the harassment be continued in the new location. Chivalry could also turn violent, especially when the targeted couple refused to pay the demanded fines or tried to resist the harassment. Participants might vandalize the couple's property, assault them physically, or even break into their home to continue the harassment indoors. Some chivalry resulted in serious injuries or property damage that could take years to recover from. The tradition was particularly cruel because it targeted couples at the moment when they were most vulnerable and hoping for happiness. The wedding night was supposed to be a time of celebration and intimacy, but chivalry turned it into a public humiliation that could destroy the marriage before it even began. The psychological impact of chivalry was often severe and long-lasting. Couples who survived the harassment might remain traumatized for years, afraid to appear in public or participate in community activities. Some marriages never recovered from the shame and stress of chivalry, ending in separation or divorce even after the harassment stopped. But chivalry also had unintended consequences that sometimes backfired on the communities that organized it. The tradition created cycles of revenge and feuding between families, as relatives of targeted couples might organize their own chivalry against the original harassers. Some communities became so divided by chivalry conflicts that normal social and economic life became impossible. The church's relationship with chivalry was complicated and often contradictory. Some religious authorities condemned it as unchristian behavior that promoted hatred and violence between community members, But other church leaders saw it as a useful tool for enforcing moral standards and preventing marriages that violated religious teachings about proper relationships. This religious ambivalence meant that chivalry could vary dramatically between communities depending on the local priest's attitude. In some areas, church officials would actively discourage chivalry and provide sanctuary for targeted couples. In other regions, priests might even participate in the harassment or bless the efforts of chivalry organizers. The tradition began to decline in the later medieval period as legal systems became more sophisticated and communities developed other ways of handling social disputes. The rise of more centralized government authority also made it harder for communities to organize vigilante justice without facing official consequences. But chivalry persisted in some rural areas well into the modern era, and traces of it can still be found in various traditional customs around the world. The practice of chivalry in some parts of North America, where communities would make noise outside newlyweds' homes, is a direct descendant of medieval chivalry, though usually much less hostile and threatening. The legacy of chivalry is a reminder of how communities can use collective action to enforce conformity and punish those who violate social norms. It shows how traditions that claim to protect community values could become forms of organized cruelty that destroyed the very social bonds they were supposed to preserve. So the next time you hear about community traditions that bring people together and enforce social standards, remember chivalry. Remember the medieval couples whose wedding nights were turned into nightmares by neighbors who claimed to be protecting community values. And think about the fine line between social cohesion and organized harassment. Number 10. The morning after inspection, public proof. If you thought the shirt test was invasive, wait until you hear about the morning after inspection, a medieval tradition that turned the most private aftermath of a wedding night into a public examination that could determine a couple's entire future. This wasn't just about checking bed sheets or asking polite questions. This was a comprehensive community investigation into every aspect of the couple's first sexual experience, conducted in front of witnesses and recorded for posterity. The morning after inspection was the culmination of all the other medieval wedding night traditions we've discussed. After the bedding ceremony, the witness requirements, the blessed bed ritual, the stocking throwing, the shoe test, the fertility soup, the shirt examination, the bread breaking, and possibly surviving chivalry, couples faced one final ordeal, proving to the entire community that they had successfully consummated their marriage and were now officially husband and wife. The inspection typically began at dawn on the morning after the wedding night. The couple wasn't allowed to sleep late, clean themselves up, or prepare for the examination in any way. The community wanted to see them exactly as they were immediately after their first night together, with all the physical evidence of consummation still visible and fresh. The first participants to arrive were usually the bride's female relatives, led by her mother or the oldest married woman in her family. These women had the authority to enter the bedchamber without permission and begin the initial examination of both the bride and the physical evidence of the wedding night. The bride would be examined first, and this examination was incredibly thorough and humiliating. The women would inspect her body for signs of sexual activity, marks on her skin, changes in her posture or movement, any physical evidence that she had engaged in intercourse. They would look for bruises, scratches, or other marks that might indicate the vigor of the sexual encounter. But the physical examination of the bride was just the beginning. The bedding itself would be stripped and examined in minute detail. The sheets, mattresses, pillows, and even the wooden bed frame would be inspected for stains, smells, or other evidence of sexual activity. Every suspicious spot would be scrutinized and discussed by the examining women. The bride's chemise or nightgown would be held up to the morning light and examined inch by inch, with particular attention paid to any stains or tears that might indicate rough treatment or successful penetration. The location, size, color, and freshness of any stains would be documented and discussed among the examiners. While the women were examining the bride and the bedding, the men in the wedding party would be conducting their own examination of the groom. This inspection focused primarily on his demeanor and behavior rather than physical evidence, because medieval people believed that a man's sexual performance could be judged by his attitude and confidence the morning after his wedding night. The groom would be questioned about his experience, not just whether consummation had occurred, but how it had gone, how many times it had happened, and and whether he felt confident about his performance. These questions were asked in front of male relatives and friends, turning what should have been private intimacy into a public performance review. The groom's physical condition would also be examined for signs of sexual activity. The men would look for scratches from fingernails, bite marks, or other evidence that the bride had been an active participant in the consummation. They would also assess his energy level and mood, because a truly successful wedding night was supposed to leave the groom feeling confident and satisfied rather than exhausted or disappointed. But the most crucial part of the morning after inspection was the community verdict, where all the evidence would be presented to the gathered wedding guests and community elders for final judgment. This wasn't a private family matter. This was a public trial where the couple's sexual performance would be evaluated and documented for legal and social purposes. The examination results would be presented by the senior examining women, who would describe in explicit detail what they had found during their investigation. They would report on the condition of the bedding, the state of the bride's clothing and body, and their professional judgment about whether genuine consummation had occurred. The male examiners would then present their findings about the groom's condition and testimony, describing his demeanor, his answers to their questions, and their assessment of his credibility and sexual competence. If the inspection results were positive, if all the evidence pointed to successful consummation, the couple would be officially declared to be truly married, and the community celebration could continue with post-wedding feasts and gift-giving ceremonies. The positive results might even be recorded in church or legal documents as official proof of the marriage's validity. But if the inspection results were negative or ambiguous, the consequences could be severe. The marriage might be declared incomplete or invalid, requiring the couple to attempt consummation again under even more scrutiny. In extreme cases, the marriage might be annulled entirely, with both families facing shame and potential legal consequences. The most controversial aspect of the morning after inspection was what happened when the evidence was inconclusive or contradictory. Medieval communities had developed elaborate procedures for handling these situations, including re-examinations, expert testimony from experienced wives and midwives, and even physical tests that were supposed to reveal hidden truths about the couple's sexual experience. Some communities employed professional wedding inspectors, usually older women who claimed to have special expertise in detecting signs of consummation. These women would be called in for difficult cases, and their judgment was considered authoritative. They might use techniques like smelling bed linens to detect specific bodily fluids, or examining stains under different types of light to determine their origin and freshness. The most extreme cases involved what were essentially medieval forensic investigations. Physical evidence would be collected and preserved. Witnesses would be interviewed separately to check for inconsistencies, and experts would be consulted to provide professional opinions about whether consummation had actually occurred. These investigations could take days or even weeks to complete, during which time the couple existed in a legal and social limbo. They weren't fully married until the inspection was complete, but they also couldn't return to their previous unmarried status. They had to wait in uncertainty while their most intimate experience was dissected and analyzed by the community. The morning after inspection also created opportunities for fraud, manipulation, and false accusations. Families who wanted to invalidate a marriage might bribe inspectors to report negative findings, while couples who hadn't actually consummated their marriage might attempt to fake evidence to pass the examination. The most common fraud involved using animal blood to create fake evidence of defloration, similar to the techniques used to pass the shirt test. But the morning after inspection was more comprehensive and harder to fool, because it involved multiple types of evidence and multiple examiners who were trained to detect deception. Some couples would attempt to create false evidence of sexual activity by using various substances to simulate bodily fluids, or by inflicting minor injuries on themselves to create marks that looked like evidence of passionate lovemaking. But experienced inspectors were often able to detect these deceptions, leading to even more serious consequences for couples caught trying to cheat. The church's attitude toward the morning after inspection was typically negative, viewing it as an invasive practice that reduced the sacred mystery of marriage to crude physical examination. Most religious authorities preferred to trust couples' sworn testimony about consummation rather than requiring physical proof. But the community pressure to verify marriages was so strong that even church opposition couldn't eliminate the practice entirely. Some priests compromised by blessing the inspection process or providing spiritual guidance to couples who were struggling with the examination requirements. The morning after inspection began to decline in the later medieval period as legal systems developed more sophisticated ways of validating marriages and as social attitudes toward privacy began to change. The development of official marriage records and certificates reduced the need for physical proof of consummation. But the practice persisted in some rural communities well into the early modern period, and traces of it can still be found in some traditional cultures around the world. The basic idea that marriage isn't complete until consummation has been publicly verified remains a persistent element of some legal and social systems. The legacy of the morning after inspection is perhaps the most disturbing reminder of how medieval society treated the most intimate aspects of human relationships as matters of public concern. It shows how communities could intrude into every aspect of personal life in the name of social order and legal validation. The tradition also reveals the enormous pressure that medieval couples faced to perform not just for each other, but for their entire community. Their wedding night wasn't a private moment of intimacy. It was a public performance that would be examined, judged, and recorded for posterity. So the next time you think about how stressful modern weddings can be, with their photographers and videographers documenting every moment, remember the morning after inspection. Remember the medieval couples who had to face community examination of their most intimate experience, who had to prove their love through physical evidence, and who lived in a society where even the marriage bed wasn't truly private. As we reach the end of our journey through the strangest medieval wedding night traditions, I think we can all agree on one thing. Modern couples have it pretty good. No bedding ceremonies with drunk relatives undressing you in public. No witnesses stationed outside your bedroom door. No priests performing exorcisms on your mattress. No communal soup made from animal testicles. No public inspection of your underwear the morning after. These 10 traditions reveal something fascinating about medieval society: the complete absence of what we consider privacy in marriage. Every aspect of a couple's wedding night, from the preparation of the bed to the morning after examination, was considered community business. Marriage wasn't seen as a private union between two individuals. It was a public institution that required community oversight and validation. The medical understanding behind many of these traditions was, frankly, terrible. Medieval people believed things about anatomy, fertility, and sexuality that we now know are completely wrong. But these beliefs shaped elaborate rituals that could determine the entire course of a person's life based on superstition and folk wisdom. The social pressure these traditions created was enormous. Medieval couples didn't just have to love each other and build a life together. They had to perform their marriage for an audience, prove their worthiness through various tests, and submit to community judgment about their most intimate experiences. But perhaps most importantly, these traditions show us how much our concepts of romance, privacy, and individual choice in marriage have changed over the centuries. What we consider basic human rights, the right to privacy, the right to marry for love, the right to keep our intimate lives private, were completely foreign concepts to medieval people. The next time you attend a modern wedding, where the couple's biggest worry might be whether the flowers match the napkins or whether Great Aunt Martha will behave at the reception, remember these medieval traditions. Remember the bedding ceremonies, the witness requirements, the fertility soups, and the morning after inspections. And maybe, just maybe, say a little prayer of gratitude that you live in an era where your wedding night is actually your own private business. Because as we've learned tonight, privacy in marriage is a relatively recent invention and one we should probably never take for granted. Thanks for joining me on this wild ride through medieval marriage customs. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history's most bizarre wedding traditions, hit that like button, subscribe for more shocking historical content, and let me know in the comments which of these traditions surprised you the most. I'll see you next time for another journey into the weird, wonderful, and often disturbing world of our ancestors. Until then, sleep well, and be grateful that no one is planning to break bread over your sleeping body or examine your underwear for evidence of anything. Modern life has its perks,